I've talked before about free market capitalism, the idea that minimal corporate regulation and minimal social welfare will lead to boosts in society and the economy. Instead, it's led to massive inequality and consolidation of wealth and power in a group of smaller and smaller numbers of people. Today I want to talk about a philosophy which has risen up alongside this. While there's certainly no shortage of corrupt and uncaring people who are abusing the system, there's also a lot of people who really do believe in it. And for these people, watching a world in which reality is increasingly at odds with their philosophy leads to a number of coping mechanisms. Firstly, they can simply ignore and deny it, pretending that things are in fact going perfectly well for more and more people. But this is increasingly hard to do, especially in a world where media is so prevalent. Then there are those who can think that things aren't going great, but this is just a stepping stone. Yes, things are bad now, but a few more tax breaks and a few more cuts to health and education, and then we'll reach a free market utopia. But like ignorance, this is hard to ignore, especially now that the experiment is entering its 5th decade. So now comes a more devious coping mechanism, and in the Western world it's often tied to religious belief. Free market capitalism says things should be getting better for everyone. Clearly, they are getting better for the rich. So if they're not getting better for the poor, perhaps it's because the poor don't want it to get better. Neo-Liberalism cannot possibly fail the poor, therefore the poor must be failing Neo-Liberalism. And this has become a very effective strategy for pushing policy. When more and more people start falling into the inequality gap, when government deficits start ballooning, rather than evaluate whether huge tax breaks to the rich are working, instead blame the money that keeps going to social welfare. Beneficiary bashing has become so ingrained in society, you almost get the feeling that it's the operating procedure now for departments who deal with beneficiaries. Yes, there are those who abuse the system, but in New Zealand, beneficiary fraud accounts for about $30 million a year. Corporate tax evasion accounts for about $1 billion a year. Yet, both government and social priority is far more weighed towards the beneficiary than the CEO. We see those in poverty as deserving to be there, and we see those who have wealth as deserving to have that. For those who truly believe in free market capitalism, poverty is a moral failing. The poor choose to be poor. In the last few weeks, we've seen the release of the Republicans' new healthcare plan and the White House's proposed budget. These two bills massively gut social services across the board, grant huge tax cuts to the rich, and further deregulate big business. Of the 66 pages of the healthcare bill, 6 whole pages are dedicated to making sure that poor people who happen to win the lottery can't get public healthcare. Such is the obsession with the idea of the welfare cheat. Tens of millions of Americans will lose insurance, but to be honest, the healthcare bill is really just a $600 billion tax cut for the very, very rich. The fact that 40,000 people a year will die is just a bonus. The bill so far hasn't made it to vote, not because it was too cruel, but because for a group of far-right Republicans, it wasn't cruel enough. Because here's the really sinister part in all of this, and it's something I'd only considered recently. I think we could be reaching the next logical progression of that moral pseudo-religious doctrine of neoliberalism. If poverty is a moral failing, it may not be enough to simply not help the poor. It might be a moral responsibility to punish them, to openly hurt them for being poor, perhaps out of some twisted belief that in doing so they will finally cease their petulant poverty. Because that's what this proposed budget and healthcare bill look like. It's not just a massive tax break. It's not just a giveaway to oil and coal and the military. It's about cutting all federal art funding. It's about cutting programs to feed children and to feed the elderly. It's about cutting drug addiction programs, cutting cancer screenings, cutting school funding, cutting infrastructure, cutting away the lives of tens of thousands of people every year. Maybe the Republicans are simply so detached from the world that they don't see it. Maybe they are true believers in the righteousness of their cause and that soon things will be better. Maybe they're too beholden to their billionaire donors to really even care about what happens to the population. Or maybe they really are trying to actively make the poor suffer. But in the day-to-day life of the 43 million Americans living below the poverty line, what's the difference? Take care and be heard.